I hesitate to introduce a halachic discussion that's relevant to this war because until now we've been discussing more hashkafic issues, questions about his orus, about tefillah, za'aka, basing ourselves on Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, and there's a lot more. In the halachic realm, especially with the pressing issue of Chatufim, Hashem Yishmerem, it's very difficult to find halachic guidelines. David sent me a link to a shir about negotiating on a halachic level for the sake of redeeming captives. And truth be told, the entire shir that David linked me up with focuses on a Mishnah in Gittin on Daf Mem Hey, which is called Pidyon Shvuyim. And there was a Tikkun Olam with regard to Pidyon Shvuyim. But let me say this at the start. I feel, and I hope my emotions are based in Torah, that somehow the study of a sugya like Pidyon Shvuyim should lead to Pidyon Shvuyim, meaning if we study the Torah of a particular halacha, and even if we cannot come to practical grips and conclusions because of the complexity of it, but nevertheless, it does give some sort of a push. I know this sounds very metaphysical, but I believe it's true. There's something about learning a sugya that's relevant to what's going on in Yonei Diyom and Yonei the Am Yisrael, that I think if we learn this together, it may not lead to any clarification and final resolutions in a halachic sense. We're not going to come out of here with a horos, psak, din. This is what the state of Israel, this is what the Tzava should do. But just, lachrosh v'lodush as hasugya, I think is meaningful in terms of our hopes that Hashem will have rachmanos. Let me say one more thing before we begin. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz taught us, you may recall, that the Chayalim who are out there being Moser Nefesh for Hatzolas Klal Yisrael are begeder haruge malchus. If they, chas v'shalom, give up their lives in the process of protecting us from our enemies, then ein kol birya v'birya chol lamod b'mechitzasa. The Yiddish in what Reb Chaim is saying, I believe, is that the Chayalim are in the process of Kiddush Hashem. Mesiras Nefesh means Kiddush Hashem. And the mitzvah that they are fulfilling is the mitzvah milchama. Because the Rambam writes in Perikei Milchus Malachim that there are three categories of milchemes mitzvah. There's Zayin Amamin, there's Amalek, and then there's Hatzolas Yisrael Mitzar Hatzor Aleim. And that third category is milchemes mitzvah. Milchemes mitzvah changes the entire halachic perspective of everything that's going on. Because, as we'll soon see, to save another Jew, when it's Reuven and Shimon, Reuven is saving Shimon's life, or even if it's Shimon and Levi, that's a mitzvah of Lo Saman al Dam Reyacha and Vashevoso Lo. But we don't have to put up our lives into danger for those mitzvahs. And that's the principle that we discussed in Masechta Sanhedrin, Chayecha Kodmin L'Chai Chavercha. And Rabbi Akiva formulates that in Masechta Bava Metzia with regard to Shnaim Sholchu Bamidbar. So Reuven doesn't have to put his life on the line for the sake of saving Shimon. When I say put his life on the line, let's say Shimon is chas v'shalom drowning, and Reuven could jump in and try to save him, but there's a very good chance that he'll be swept away and he won't be able to save him. He'll die in the process. He's not chayev. Chayecha kodmi. But all that changes when it comes to the mitzvah milchama. And what that means is that we're no longer simply within the context of lo tamad al dam riyacha. We have now entered into an entirely new complex of mitzvos that are generated in order to save Klal Yisrael. We're no longer involved in saving someone from drowning, chas v'shalom. We're talking about saving Klal Yisrael. We're talking about a confrontation with an enemy that's tsar aleinu, that wants to destroy us. That's a mitzvah milchama. And the Minchas Chinuch is very famous for saying, but I think it's so obvious, that with regard to the mitzvah milchama, we don't say, well, chayecha kodmin, and pikuach nefesh is docha kol haTorah kulam. In milchama, there is no pikuach nefesh. Because it's not that you are saving him. It's that you are involved in saving all of Klal Yisrael. And in a certain sense, you become one with Klal Yisrael. You no longer stand as a separate entity in which you say, Chayecha Kodmin, my life comes first. No. We're talking about all of Klal Yisrael together as one body, as one entity. So we no longer make these calculations of Pikuach Nefesh. Why do you have to give up your life in order to fulfill the mitzvah? Because we're not talking about a mitzvah of Lo Saman al Dam Riyacha. We're talking about the mitzvah milchama. And we pointed out in the past, and I want to reiterate, that within the context of the mitzvah milchama, there's a separate lav, a lo taseh, of lo tarotz mipneim, lo tira mehem, not to be overwhelmed by fear. And the Rambam writes in Hilchos Malachim Perek Ches that he has to have in mind when he goes out to battle the idea of Yichud Hashem, that he's fighting for Yichud Hashem. He's no longer fighting for one individual or another individual. What's at stake here is Yichud Hashem, is the protection of Am Yisrael, of the people that Hashem chose, the Am Skula Mamlechas Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And I believe that within the context of the mitzvah milchama, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz is pointing out that an individual that falls in battle and gives up his life, that is a mitzvah on the highest level of Harugei Malchus, about which we said, Ein kol birya u'birya yichol lamod b'mechitzosan. And I believe that if we vacillate back and forth on this issue, whether or not a person who is killed in a battle is called a kadosh or not a kadosh, because it wasn't as if, he was given a choice to eat chazer or to, bow down to an idol or will kill you. So it's not a harg val yavar in the sense of a decision that you make to give up your life. But I think there's a broader definition of kadosh over here. In this context, when you are giving up your life to save Klal Yisrael, the entity of Klal Yisrael is Yichud Hashem. If a person gives up his life for Yichud Hashem, I believe he's called a kadosh. And even in Afilu Tim Tzalom, you'll argue against me, and he's not called a kadosh, but grant me that he's called Arugei Malchus. And that's, I think, what Reb Chaim Shulevitz was pointing out. Now, if defending the country against our enemy is a Milchemes mitzvah, then Talmud Torah, which is the greatest of all mitzvahs, is nidches mipnei mitzvah. Every mitzvah in the Torah trumps Talmud Torah. And the reason for that is because Gadol Talmud Shemevil Lidei Maisa. I remember once Rav Lichtenstein, Zichron Levrach, had a chidush. He wanted to suggest that if a person would continue learning when he's chayav in a mitzvah, and he ignores the mitzvah for the sake of Talmud Torah, then it reveals and establishes that his Torah was shalom and as lasos, and Gadol Talmud shemevil lidei ma'isa. In other words, embedded in the mitzvah, the essence of the mitzvah Talmud Torah is almanas l'kayim. And if a mitzvah comes by and he says, no, I'm busy learning, and he doesn't cease his learning for the sake of that mitzvah, then it wasn't a Talmud almanas lasos. But with whatever your definition that you work with is, the mitzvahs are doche Talmud Torah. Look at Avraham Avinu in this coming Sedra. Yoshev Pesach Ha'ol Kechom Hayom, he's being makabel p'nei Shechina. That's probably a mitzvah that's even greater than Talmud Torah. And yet, vayar vayartz l'krosam. So I get invited to a wedding. And I could be misameach to chas and kala. So I say, no, I'm busy learning. I have a mitzvah of bikur cholim, of nichum avelim, of many, many mitzvahs that could come by. And I'm going to say, well, wait a minute, osek b'mitzvah, I'm involved in Talmud Torah. No. So in this issue about whether Talmidei Chachamim who are oskim v'Torah should go out to the battlefield, should be signing up for Tzal for the sake of the mitzvah Milchama, the Pashtus, before we find Pilpulim, is it's no different than any other mitzvah. So the answer might be, well, the army doesn't need me, it could go on without me, it's Efshel L'Kaim Al Yidei Acherim, and therefore it's not Doche Talmud Torah. Maybe the answer is that the Talmidei Chacham who are Oskim B'Torah have a special din, a special category, they don't need to go out in the army. Maybe the halacha is that we got to split up Klal Yisrael, Elef Lamateh. You remember Rav Chaim Shulevitz's discussion that they split up the group into two. But again, all these are pilpulim. They may be correct. I'm not questioning them, but I am pointing out that those are answers to a question. Why is it that for the sake of Talmud Torah, we don't drop everything, leave the yeshiva, and sign up for Tzal? I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to young boys. And the pashtus is, if we define this and categorize it as a mitzvah milchama, then the mitzvah milchama overrides the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Not because Hatzolos Nefashos is greater than Talmud Torah. On the contrary, the Gemara says in Megillah that Talmud Torah is even greater than Hatzolos Nefashos. And Mordechai was L'Rov Echa because he had to be Osek in Hatzolos Nefashos, and he no longer was able to function on the Sanhedrin. And the Taz has a whole explanation that Torah inherently is a greater mitzvah than all the other mitzvahs, including Hatzolos Nefashos, but nevertheless in Kedima, Tachlis, You have to give up Talmud Torah for any mitzvah in the Torah, and certainly for Milchemes mitzvah. And now we have to come up with all sorts of explanations, why the Gedolei Torah, in a certain sense, had this idea, no, the guys have to be learning in yeshiva. But what's now on the perek, Mashomed al perek, as we say, is Pidyon Shvuyim. And everyone is quoting this Mishnah in Gittin. I have a problem. I don't know that this Mishnah in Gittin is relevant. I'll read to you the language of the Mishnah in Gittin on Mem Heyam and Aleph. And the Mishnah says, Ein podin es hashvuyim yeser al kedei demehem mipnei tikun olam. So the Mishnah establishes that there's a ceiling to how much we are allowed to pay in order to redeem someone from captivity. And therefore, we have to begin to understand in the present situation, what would be Kedei Demeha? How much are we allowed to trade off to buy the freedom of the Chatufim, the captives? Because we have to set a limit, a ceiling. The Gemara is going to offer two different explanations as to why, what is the essence of this Tikkun Olam. But it occurs to my mind, and my very limited mind, that at first glance, this Mishnah is not even relevant. You're going to hear shiurim upon shiurim, trying to understand the halachic response to the present current situation based on this Mishnah. I don't know that the Mishnah is relevant, and I'll tell you why. What are we trading here? Are we buying people as their ransom money? And we've seen it over and over and over again. Whenever the terrorists, Yamach Shemam, take hostages, what they want is terrorists. They want us to free terrorists from jail. And in the case of Gilad Shalit, the price was very high. 1,000 mechablim for one Israeli soldier. I think that there's another set of halachic principles that are relevant, and certainly more relevant than this Mishnah in Gittin. And those are the issues of saving one person at the expense of giving up other lives. Because it's scientifically proven, there's no question, there's evidence that those 1,000 terrorists that we let out of the cell came back and killed probably hundreds of Jews. So if you take, for example, the situation of 100 captives in Uganda, correct? And there, they were demanding the freedom of 40 terrorists. And when the issue came up, not of sending in forces, but rather, can we and may we and should we agree to those terms and free 40 terrorists? They brought in one of the heads of the Shin Bet, and he testified in front of 7 Rabbanim that these 40 terrorists would kill tens of Jews. 40 terrorists. I'm not talking about 1,000 terrorists. In this case that we're facing currently, who knows how many thousands of terrorists they're going to ask for? Not just 1,000. So now you have a very complex set of halachas here. Surely you want to save the captives because the terrorists are threatening to kill them one by one, and we know that we have to take those threats seriously. But on the other hand, to let the terrorists out of jail to save these Jews, 100 and more in Uganda, knowing full well that the 40 terrorists that you're trading off are going to kill who knows how many hundreds of Jews. Rahman al-Islam. Now, Kolshkin, if the numbers go higher and higher in terms of how many terrorists they demand to free. So what we're dealing with is saving immediate lives, meaning from immediate danger for the sake of protecting, or shall we say, for the sake of saving immediate lives at the expense of future deaths on the part of Klal Yisrael. So certainly we're not giving over a Jew to die. You know, in the famous case in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta in Trumos, you know, where they circle the Jewish community. They say, give us this Jew, otherwise we'll raise the whole city. We discussed it in Sanhedrin, if you recall. And the psak is Yomusu kulam v'al yimsu lem nefesh achas mi Yisrael. Here, in this situation of freeing terrorists from jails, we're not being moser nefesh achas li Yisrael. But nevertheless, even if we're not being moser nefesh achas mi Yisrael, and I can't pinpoint one particular nefesh that I'm giving for hariga, but what about all the Jews that will die, according to the predictions of the experts? Doesn't that seem almost logical to say that we should give up lives of Jews for the sake of these Jews? Obviously, there's a difference because these Jews are in immediate danger, whereas the terrorists, that's down in the future. The famous tshuva, the Noda B'Yehuda, that Pikuach Nefesh is always defined and determined by what is the situation now. And he was opposed to autopsy when somebody died from a rare disease, even though we could learn so much from the autopsy, because right now there's no chole b'fanecha. And the Noda B'Yehuda said that if you want to override the Isa of Nituche Mesim, which, by the way, is three different averos are involved, then you have to have an immediate pikuach nefesh. There's another patient who's suffering now from that same rare disease. But the fact that 50 years from now, through your medical research, you'll be able to save lives, the Noda B'Yehuda is not questioning that premise. That's not pikuach nefesh. So everything has to be determined now. So the fact that we're letting these monsters out of jail and they're going to come back to haunt us and kill us down the line, that's not to be considered. And that was the basis of Rav Ovadia Yosef's tshuva with regard to Uganda. And he came back to the prime minister of then, Yitzhak Rabin, and he said to him, yes, al pi halacha, you'd be allowed to free 40 terrorists, because right now there's no impending danger, so to speak. There's no chola v'fanecha. So based on the fact that A, we're not being Moser Yisrael, and B, no Jew is dying now, it's only a future down the line situation, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be. Therefore, he said it's okay. And then the prime minister, as you know, came up with a different idea. And he said, rather than free terrorists from the jails, it's better for us if we send the Chayalim out there. Once again, you have the issue, can you send Chayalim? That's really dangerous. All the way from Israel to Uganda to face these terrorists and free the hostages. But that was the shikul of Rabin and his cabinet. And Rav Ovadia Yosef said to him, to endanger the lives of those chayalim that are going should be a very serious issue. Now it's immediate danger. So you're going to put chayalim into danger for the sake of saving the hostages from danger? We don't make those kind of trade-offs.
All war is like that.
Excellent. Came Rav Ovadia and he said to the prime minister, you have my full backing. If there was a Melech B'Yisrael and he would decide it's time for Milchama. And with regard to Milchamis Mitzvah, the Rambam says we don't need the approval of the Sanhedrin Agdola of 71 elders, and the Melech can make that decision, and that Shikol Adas on his own. You, again, this is very controversial, but you as Prime Minister of Israel are in the position to make that decision. You see the whole picture, and you're leading the country. You have a din of Melech. Again, Rav Kook used to differentiate between Minu Gavra of Melech and Mishpat Melech, so that the Prime Minister might not have a Minu Gavra of a Melech, but he might have Mishpat Melech. Are you familiar with that? And again, a very deep Lumdisha tshuva. I think it's a whole bunch of tshuvas of Rav Kook. I'm talking about Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook. And within the context of Milchama, then as we said at the outset, the concept of Pikuach Nefesh is completely sideswiped. It's irrelevant. So we are involved in Milchama against the terrorists. Pele v'chidush. We're not invading another country. We're not crossing over the borders, and we're not bringing tanks and missiles and so forth into Uganda. It's almost like a Hatzalah campaign. And as we said before, Chayecha Kodmi, you don't put up your life because of Lotamet al Dam Re'echa. Says Rav Ovadia Yosef name. When we're battling against the terrorists, it has a din of Milchama. Whether it's on this ground or on that ground, they are trying to destroy all Jews. And that's why, leaving out the Mishnah in Gittin, I believe that the best answer to our question of freeing terrorists in order to save the people who are hostage, that has to be understood within the context of Milchama. These are Dinei Milchama. I'm not going to ask the question whether or not these terrorists that we're freeing from the jail are going to come back and haunt us and kill us. Because Pikuach Nefesh doesn't play a role over here. We're talking about Milchama. So in my humble opinion, the greatest breakthrough, the most important, significant breakthrough in this halachic realm, as far as the current events and this situation is concerned, that was Rav Ovadia Yosef's breakthrough, that our battle against terrorism is a Milchama, is a mitzvah Milchama. And in our current situation, it's a lot simpler than the situation of Uganda, where a group of terrorists, some were Germans and some were this and that, they took 100 hostages. Here, we're talking about a nation, or I don't know if you want to say it's the whole nation, I don't want to get into that issue, that is saying, they want to destroy us. And they've proven it. They could have taken over almost the whole South. This is clearly a Milchama. And if this is a Milchama, forget about Pikuach Nefesh. But now the question is, within the context of Milchama, if our goal in this Milchama is Lazar Yisrael, to save Israel from this terrible Oyev, then what's our best policy over it? The thought always occurred to me. I don't know, I shouldn't say this publicly, but it always bothered my mind. What would have been the halachic response if, again, it's all theoretical, right? If Gilad Shalit had come to a rabbi and said, "Rabbi, should I commit suicide?" Did that thought ever cross your mind? How many Jews would have said, I live on a street here in Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is called Roei Klein. Do you know who Roei Klein was? He jumped on a hand grenade to save his buddies. Maybe, again, don't shoot me for saying this, but maybe Gilad Shalit should have jumped on a hand grenade in order to save Klal Yisrael from 1,000 terrorists. I don't know. Again, Just maybe I'm getting too emotional. I apologize. Now, saving terrorists, I'm sorry, excuse me. Now, saving hostages is also part of a whole shikul milchama, especially if there are any soldiers there, because, a soldier has to know that, we're behind him. We'll do everything that we have to do in order to save him. But on the other hand, in the overall picture of how we defeat our enemy, which is the ultimate goal of this milchama, it's very, very complicated to figure out. But again, as I said at the outset, the writers and the speakers amongst the Bali Halacha today begin their discussion with the Mishnah and Gittin and the Takana of Ein Podim Es Hashvuyim V'Yeser Al Kedei Demeim. So they want to know what happens when the terrorists are going to ask for Yeser Al Kedei Demeim. There's a machlokas Rishonim what exactly Yeser Kedei Demeim means. Most of the Rishonim and the Radbaz develops it. They're of the opinion that Demeim means how much would you sell a person on the slave market, on the Ke'eved HaNimkar B'Shuk. Obviously, today that's irrelevant. But there are other Rishonim who say, well, if let's say a guy would be involved in a maso matan, to free captives and so forth, so what would be the going rate? Probably one per one, which would mean that they could ask for 200 and I don't know what the latest number is, 29 terrorists to free. So let me take a few minutes of your time to talk about Ein Podim Es Hashvuyim V'Yeser Al Kedei Demeim. The Gemara offers two explanations. What motivated the Chachamim to make this Tikkun Olam? First definition is Ducha de Tzibur, which means to deplete the finances of the Jewish community, monies that are needed for aniyim, and deplete it because your captors are demanding an enormous, exaggerated sum of money. Then the Gemara offers another explanation. The garve v'yasvei tfei. It means we will entice them to come back because we paid such an enormous amount of money. Gemara asks, "My nafkamina," and the Gemara says, supposing the captive himself, or his family members, or his close friends could raise an enormous sum of money, it would not in any way deplete the city kupa of tzedakah, the finances for the city, but on the other hand, it's going to definitely attract and entice those who kidnap Jews to come by and kidnap more and more Jews. Look what money we're getting. And that's enough nafkamina. But what's fascinating here is Tosas's kasha. Because this mission is on Daf Mem Hey, and if you fast forward about 10 blot, the Gemara tells a story in Gittin on Daf Nun Ches about Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya finds himself bekrach gadol sheberomi, probably Rome itself, and they tell him about a certain tinok, a young boy who was taken captive. And this in Perek HaNizakin, which is, as you know, the Perek that's most relevant to Tisha B'Av, to Churban Abayis, all the Agaditas, Kamsa B'Kamsa, etc., etc. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, when he visits this child, and he's so impressed by the child, he sees him through the Beit HaSurim, he walks out and he makes a statement that we have to spend all the money in the world to ransom this boy. Why? Because Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya began a pasuk in Tanakh, and this boy, rattled off the entire pasuk. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya came to the conclusion that Asid hu lios mora hora b'Yisrael. And the Gemara indeed says that he redeemed this boy with an enormous sum of money, and the boy, within a short amount of time, became a major Mora Hora b'Yisrael. The Gemara identifies him as Rabbi Shmuel, one of the great Tanoim. So Tosfos in two places, here in the Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey, and there in the Sugya of Rabbi Chananya, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya on Daf Nun Ches. In both places, he asks the question, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You want to redeem a captive with all the money in the world? What about the Mishnah of Ein Podenes Hashvuyim B'Yesod Kedei Demain? And Tosfos gives two answers on Daf Mem Hey and a third answer on Daf Nun Ches. Fascinating is the answer on Daf Nun Ches because it has so much practical implication. He writes, Ki ika sakonis nefashos podim shvuyim yesar kedei demain. If there's a chashash that they'll kill him, so his life might be in danger, then that's called pikuach nefesh. It overrides everything. Even this takana has to be set aside, and we'll pay all the money in the world to save a person from death. Tosfos and Gittin offers two other answers. The first answer he offers is that mishum lefi shahaya muflag bechachma, that the rules of Pinyan Shvuyim change when the person who's b'shevi is muflag bechachma. It's interesting because in this particular case of Rabbi Yeshua, he wasn't, I don't know if he was muflag b'chachma already at that time, or the anticipation was he will become a muflag b'chachma. But in any event, the fact that he knew Psukim and Tanakh is pretty impressive, wouldn't you admit? And the last answer in Tosfos is Inami B'shas Churban Abayis Lo Shayach De Lo Ligrave. That because Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was living at the time of the Churban, therefore the rules of the game change. Tosfos doesn't elaborate why that should be so. But it's interesting that Tosfos puts all the emphasis on the second explanation of the Gemara, which we said before is in order to not entice them to come back for more. Delo ligravu v'laisi tfeh. Sounds like Tosfos may have accepted that understanding la'alocha, which would mean that even if you had bombs of money, you would not be allowed to redeem and ransom a captive, despite the fact that it doesn't deplete the community chest. Now, the first answer to Tosfos and Gittin on Daf Mem Hey is muflag b'chachma. That would seem to apply in both explanations of the Gemara, I think. For the sake of muflag b'chachma, we don't take into consideration the enormous amount of money and the strain on the communal chest, nor do we take into consideration that they're going to come back again and again for more. Now, when we go to Tosfos Daf Nun Ches with regard to Pikuach Nefesh, and then we suspend the restriction of Ein Podin as Shvuyim, etc., because of Pikuach Nefesh, once again, that could work out according to either of the two shitos, the two explanations of the Gemara for the Tikkun. Now, in our situation today, I'm not sure if we have a muflag b'chachma. I tend to doubt it. I could be wrong. But one thing I know for sure, it's sakonis nefashos. That's uvda b'shetem. So the question becomes, are we permitted to ransom captives at any price, even an enormous, exorbitant price, if there's sakonis nefashos? If we look in the Rambam, in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim Perek Ches Halacha Yud Beis, Ein Podas Hashvuyim B'Yesod Al Dameim Mipnei Tikun Olam, Shelo Yu Ha'oivim Rodfim Achreim Lishbosam. He paskins like the second explanation. Would there be any difference if you had the money or not? The Rambam omits it because it's irrelevant. Would there be any difference if it was Shas HaChurban? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what Shas HaChurban does over here, if we understood that. And as far as Pikuach Nefesh is concerned, the Rambam didn't qualify that in the case of Pikuach Nefesh, you'd be allowed to pay Yosem Miktei Dehemim. And we have a principle that we inherited from Reb Chaim Brisker, that Stimas Lashon Rambam means that the Rambam is Sosem, and he doesn't qualify, so it's unqualified. That's the first Reb Chaim in the Sefer, about Karka Olam, if you remember. And the Shulchan Aruch, by the way, in the Halachas of Tzedakah, also pretty much paraphrases the Rambam almost verbatim, and that's in Siman Reish Nun Beis in Yoreh De'ah. So this kicks up the whole issue of whether or not we accept the sheet of Tosas La'alocha than in the case of Pikuach Nefesh. So as far as that's concerned, this is a machlokas that recurs over and over again throughout Jewish history in the poskim. You're going to have poskim that are going to say, even in the case of Pikuach Nefesh, ain podim. You're going to have poskim who are going to accept Tosfos and say, in Pikuach Nefesh, we are podim. And many of the poskim in the later generations write that the minhag l'maisa, because there was situations throughout Klal Yisrael, unfortunately, was to be poda yesal kedei demeim, and with the assumption, the premise that there's pikuach nefesh. The big question is the Marami Rutenberg. You're all familiar with this question. The Marami Rutenberg died in jail, I believe after 7 years in jail. And for 7 years, he refused to allow the community to be poda him because it was yeser miknei demeim. What happened to pikuach nefesh? Sakonis nefashos. What happened to muflig b'chachma? Where did all this go? So the one who tried to deal with this question head on and get into the mindset of the Marami Rutenberg was the Marshal Reb Shlomo Luria 5 centuries ago. And he first toys with the possibility that the Marami Rutenberg held himself, he was so humble, he held himself to be someone that's not muflig b'chachma. The Marshal rejects this outright because he says the Marami Rutenberg certainly was aware of the fact that he was the teacher of all the Gedolei Rishonim of Ashkenaz. Amongst his Talmidim were the Mordechai and the Agos Maimonios and the Rosh. I mean, these are the Gedolei Ashkenaz. And this possibility of transmitting the Torah was lost because he was taken into captivity. So the Marshal comes up with another svar, fascinating svar. And he says the following: as a general rule, we don't apply the principle of Tosfos of muflag b'chachma. Why? Because the captors, they don't know whether this person is muflag b'chachma or not. What they do know is who is the gadol adar. Even the goyim know that, and they're enticed to capture and kidnap the gadol adar because they know they can demand a very high ransom for the gadol adar. And therefore, in this situation, came along the Maram and he said the following: when we know and appreciate the gadol adar, when we know and appreciate that this individual that was taken captive is muflag b'chachma, then, as we saw in Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, we could be podeh, even Yeser al Kedei Demen. But the Maram Rutenberg was talking about a case where they knew, and they earmarked him because they knew he was the gadol adar. Muflag b'chachma is a very good and powerful consideration to allow us to be podeh someone who's muflag b'chachma, even al Yeser al Kedei Demen. And to overlook the fact that by giving the captors such an enormous sum of money, they're going to be tempted to come back in again. But not in the case of the Maram Rutenberg. He understood very well that they singled him out because they appreciated who he was. They knew exactly what role he played in the Jewish community. And the Maram Rutenberg was afraid, and probably justifiably, that if they would pay enormous sums to be podeh him, then all of the great leaders, the very well-known leaders of Klal Yisrael that represented Klal Yisrael, were in danger of being taken captive. He did not want to expose all of the great Talmidim to such a danger. In fact, many of them were murdered anyway. During the Crusades, you're talking 9 centuries, a very rough period of Jewish history. And then Mordechai was murdered. And Agos Maimonides was murdered. The Rosh checked out. He took a fast ship and he ended up in Spain. Very weird. He was an Ashkenazi, shows up in Barcelona, meets the Rashba, who's the Rashka Bahag in Spain, the Talmud of the Ramban. And after the Rashba gets to know the Rosh very quickly, he sees that the Rosh is a gadol b'Torah, enormous. And when the community in Spain recognized the greatness of the Rosh, after the death of the Rashba, they appointed the Rosh as a Rosh Yeshiva. Here's an Ashkenazi Rav coming from Germany who is going to have the greatest influence on Sephardic Jewry. In fact, the Beis Yosef, more often than not, will paskin like the Rosh, even though the Beis Yosef is your, like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, he's your Sfaradi. So as I said before, if you go through the poskim back and forth, the Maram Lublin 5 centuries ago said we don't allow Yesemik Tegdeim in a case of Pikuach Nefesh, of Sakaras Nefashos. There were tshuvas later on that rejected the Maram Lublin, like the Knesset Yechezkel and the Beis Hillel and other poskim, and they came to the conclusion that in Pikuach Nefesh we accept Tosfos' principle based on the Gemara Daf Nun Ches of Yeshua ben Chananya, that we will pay for Yesem Dekdem when there's Pikuach Nefesh. And that seems to be the minhag that was accepted in the last 300, 400, 500 years. Which would mean that today we are not bound by the Mishnah and Gittin when we deal with the question of Podim Yesem Dekdem. But I think what we are bound with is the overall picture of the Milchama. And is it a smart thing to capitulate for the sake of the hostages? And I'm not chas v'shalom, I can't begin to tell you how much I feel for them. But for the sake of the overall war effort, in order to achieve our ultimate goal. And in that sense, I think what Rav Ovadia Yosef said to Marabim at the time of Entebbe, that you are at the top of the echelon here, you have the perspective, you have to decide what would be the best for this war effort. And Rav Ovadia said that destroying the terrorists in Uganda is a war effort. How much more so today in our current situation? We're in a war effort. So it's not Yeser al Kedei Demayan. And as we said before, we're not even talking about Yeser Mikdei Demayan. We're talking about Pikuach Nefesh. Why? Because we are freeing terrorists who are no doubt about it. They're going to come and kill more of us. On the other hand, we have the urgent Pikuach Nefesh of the hostages. How do you judge that? So I don't think the issue here boils down to the Mishnah in Gittin of Yeser al Kedei Demayan for a number of reasons. And I want to add one very important point here. Not only is the minhag that we pay in ransom Yeser Mikdei Demayan for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh, that seems to be the accepted minhag. But I think there's another reason why in our current situation we don't apply the rule and the limitation of the Mishnah in Gittin of Yeser Mikdei Demayan. Because Tosas says that at the time of the Churban, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya disregarded the limitation of Ein Podem Es Hashrim V'Yeser al Kedei Demayan. Why? So Tosas adds, because the logic of Kidei Shelo Liguvu Laisei Tfei doesn't apply during Shas HaChurban. And when I hear the words of Tosas, I think of the Arch of Titus. They were taking all the Jews into captivity. Are you going to tell me that because we gave them an enormous sum of money, therefore that's going to entice them to take more Jews in captivity? They had a free reign during the Shas HaChurban. They would decide who they wanted to take into captivity and who not. I think there's also a psychological element here that maybe during Shas HaChurban, if we could pay a price, an enormous price, I grant you, exorbitant, way out of the league, in order to save a Jew. I mean, look what happened now. Help me out with her name. For a moment, it slips my mind. The Chayelet that was just freed. Can you help me out here? But you have to unmute yourself.
Ori.
Orit?
Ori.
Okay. By the way, did you see the video of her mother being mafresh challah a week before? Oh, man. If not for the fact that she was freed, I couldn't psychologically survive that video, but although I cried when I heard her, but, it's Monday morning quarterbacking. I knew that Orit was freed, so it was easy for me to hear the mother a week ago, crying as she's being mafresh challah. But you see how her return pumps us up. In my mind, it means that if Tzahal was able to save her, maybe they could save others. Take, for example, what we spoke about a few weeks ago, Edri, remember? Rachel Edri. I mean, she and her husband were surrounded by, I'm not sure if it's 4 or 5 terrorists, holding a rimon over her head. And the Imam was able to come in zoop within seconds and kill all the Mechablin. Halavai, we should be zochet to such nisim and iflot. But the fact that we succeeded in one case, at least for me, that gives me hope. And that's what I think Tosas has in mind when he says Shas HaChurban, that at Shas HaChurban we were in such a low state of depression when hordes and hordes, untold millions of Jews were just trucked out to be slaves. Every single Jew could be an inspiration, if we can save a Jew. Give us a little bit more of a morale. We were so demoralized. And today, you ask me whether we're holding B'Shas HaChurban, meaning these whatever you want to call them, these butchers. I mean, as I said in the first discussion, they're chayas b'shtei raglayim. They're not going to be inhibited one way or the other to come back and take more. I mean, that's their whole essence. So it's like the case of the Churban. I mean, we're not dealing with, we gave them this, we gave them that, and they're going to come back and they're going to be enticed. None of those considerations, I think, are relevant. So just to summarize, as I said at the outset, we're not here to paskin shilas. But I think what's very important is that we divide up the two issues here and not overlap between the two. One issue is freeing terrorists in such a deal for the sake of Pidyon Shvuyim, knowing full well the terrorists are going to come back and haunt us and destroy us and kill us. And from that perspective, it's a very serious shaila. Maybe you could say that the hostages are in immediate danger, whereas the sakana of the terrorists going out of jails, as we said in the Entebbe raid, is down the line, and we can activate the Noda B'Yehuda. And again, we're not being moser any Jew to the goyim, which would be a cruel act of ritzicha. No. We're just letting it's like what do we call it? A Hilchos Shabbos. It's grama. And within this context, we have to say that letting terrorists out of jail is not an act of ritzicha, but it's an act of hatzol. Then we have another issue. Are we allowed to go yesem mikdei demand? We've come to the conclusion that freeing terrorists from jails is not an act of ritzicha, and we don't have to consider the future pikuach nefesh. We have to consider and focus on the immediate pikuach. That's fine, but how many terrorists do we give up? And here we get into the Mishnah of yesem mikdei demand, and we say, number one, it might not apply today in our situation because of pikuach nefesh. Number two, it might not apply because we have a kind of a shas hachurban. But I think the bottom line of all this is that forget about all these kidei demams and all the pikuach nefeshes and mesiras this and future this. It all boils down to the mitzvah milcham. And that's where, in a very, very paradoxical sense, the halacha sort of has to take a step back. Here we'd like to know the answer to every single question by learning the halacha. But there are some sticky issues in milchama. We don't have all the myriads of laws and regulations that govern milchama. Is there a siman in Shulchan Aruch, hilchas milchama? Do we send this infantry here and this brigade here and anti-missiles and anti-that? And where do we set our chayalim and how do we, proceed and what's the strategy and how do we win this battle? There is no Shulchan Aruch for hilchas milchama. We know about Mashuach Milchama and the Chosavim Arachas Milchama, and we know about the fact that the Rambam says that you have to have a Yichud Hashem in mind and there's an Isur Pachad, all that we know. But when it comes down to the issue, how do we achieve our goal? How do we defeat our enemy? I don't know. I defy anyone to come up with a Shulchan Aruch that gives us the rules for that. And in this particular current situation, who can know the rules? Yiratzah his will, that we should be zocher to see hatzlacha in this mitzvah milchama. And chas v'sholem, if we have losses, we already lost 2 Givati boys today, 20-year-old boys. I'm afraid to ask my son if he knows. One of them is from his neighborhood, Re'ut, in Modi'in. Last name is Lifshitz. I'm sure my son, who lives in that neighborhood, knows the family, but I'm not going to call my son, even though I'm curious, because in case he doesn't know and he's out there, I don't know where he is. He doesn't tell me where he is. I don't want to get him upset. I'm sure he'll find out. So that's it, Rabbosai, for tonight. I hope you got something out of it. And as I say, just learning the sugya, I think, has some sort of impact in Shamayim. And Divrei Torah, Divrei Chachma, Divrei Chizuk, I think when we all get together, I think it's very, very important, very meaningful. So again, I want to thank you for being with us.
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much.
Gosh. So next week we'll do the Kaddish thing, or?
Oh, are you interested in that? Please send me a message, and let me.
I don't know. I don't know what people are interested, but I'm interested. I don't know.
Yeah, the question is,
very much.
Does a chayal who falls in battle have the status of a kadosh? And if we get a positive answer to that question, then I want to ask another question. Let's say a person was killed simply because he's a Jew, like 1,400 Jews that died on Shabbos Shmini Atzeres, or 6 million Jews who died on Kiddush Hashem. Is that called Kiddush Hashem? Are they Kiddushim? They didn't make a choice decision. They weren't out there for Atzolos Klal Yisrael. They were simply murdered because they were Jewish. What status do they have? And then Nafka Mina is going to be, if someone's not such a pious Jew, does he go straight through the pearly gates and have a chelek in Olam Haba Asher Kol Birya V'Birya Eini Yochel Lamod B'Mechitzos? If that subject interests you, just let me know. Okay, then, because I'd have to prepare